Say awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion, put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city, shake off the dust and arise.
So to be seen as a Messiah, a son of David, would immediately bring their attention upon you because you were a threat to Rome and to them. And so the power base for the Sadducees is their wealth and their association with Rome and their duty for Rome to keep the people in line and remove any threats to Rome. The other group that's going to play an even greater role in the ministry of Yeshua is the Pharisees, as we said. They're also going to play a great role in the lives of the early believers, who are the focus of this study. The Jewish Encyclopedia says this about them: the party representing the religious views and practices and hopes of a kernel of the Jewish people in the time of the Second Temple and in opposition to the priestly Sadducees. They were accordingly scrupulous observers of the law as interpreted by the Sopharim or the scribes in accordance with tradition. And so remember, we spoke of the Sopharim. They were the men of the great assembly. They started some traditions, and this is where the Pharisees derived their authority. They were the interpreters of the law, particularly for everyday life. They will be leaders and expounders in the synagogue services by the time we get to Yeshua's day. And although they kept their association with the common people, they kept it at a minimum. They didn't associate with non-Jews either. And the reason we'll get to next in the Jewish Encyclopedia, it says parashah, and the singular parishaya denotes one who separates himself or keeps away from persons or things impure in order to attain a degree of holiness and righteousness required in those who would commune with God. The Pharisees had expounded upon the purity laws to the degree that they separated themselves from almost everything and everyone. This expansion comes from Torah law that, as I said, that says anything unclean that touches something unclean makes that clean thing unclean. And here's what the Torah says. Listen to what it says. It says, "You shall make yourselves unclean by these. Whatever touches their carcasses will be unclean until evening. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean till evening. Whoever picks up one of their carcasses must wash his clothes. He will be unclean until evening." And so if you touch something unclean, like an unclean animal, it renders you unclean. Other things that can render you unclean, according to the Torah, are sexual or monthly discharges, diseases. If you are touched by someone with a skin disease, it renders you unclean. Things like mildew will make your house unclean, can render your house unclean, and the occupant as well. So the Pharisees will expand on these things. And this is one area which will play a heavy role in the life of Yeshua, as we'll see next week. And it's also going to play a heavy role in the life of the believers after Yeshua. And so I felt it necessary to bring this up tonight, but understand that there's really no area of God's law that they didn't make more stringent or, in some cases, relaxed. They relaxed some of God's commands. Due to the time, we're not going to get into them today, but we will cover some of these things. So as you can imagine, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were at odds with one another. And yet, we often see them confront Yeshua together. But understand, there's no love lost between them, even though they may confront Yeshua together. The Pharisees stuck their noses into the temple services, and because of that, they weren't liked by the Sadducees. The Jewish Encyclopedia says this: in the temple itself, the Pharisees obtained a hold on at an early date when they introduced the regular daily prayers besides the sacrifice and the institution of the ma'amadot, the representatives of the people during the sacrifices. Moreover, they declared that the priests were but deputies of the people. And so what they did is they instituted many of the temple services, some from the sages in the time of the Great Assembly, as we read earlier. But here we're told that they also made a way for the Ma'amad. And those were the elders from around Israel, every district of Israel, who would stand in the court of men and recite the daily prayers with the priests, and they would witness the daily offerings. Let's read just a little farther about this, what they instituted. The daily recital of the Shema, as well as other parts of the divine service, is a Pharisaic institution. The Pharisees, having established their Habarah, or league, in each city to conduct the service. The tefillin, or phylacteries, as a symbol of consecration on the head and arm, appear to be a counterpart of the high priest's diadem and breastplate. So with the mezuzah as a symbol of consecration on the home. Though both were derived from Scripture, the original talismanic character having been forgotten. On the other hand, the Pharisees introduced rites in the temple which originated in popular custom and were without foundation in the law. And so much of the temple services, by the time we get to Yeshua, is not according to what the priests would have done any longer, not according to what Scripture would allow, but done according to what the Pharisees dictated. Whatever else they envisioned as correct. And I'm going to open next week with an example of how they go completely against Scripture to institute their own festival services. Josephus tells us how they were able to accomplish this. It says this in Josephus: "And whatsoever they, the Pharisees, do about the divine worship, the prayers and sacrifices, they, the priests, perform them according to their direction, insomuch that the cities give great attestations to them on account of their entire virtuous conduct, both in actions and in lives, and their discourses also." Now, I want to look at some of these next week, because we at Sar Shalom take a stand on some of these things that the Pharisees have done that others don't. But the other party that we're going to look at that play a great role in the life of Yeshua in the early synagogue will be the Herodians. And this will be in the life of Yeshua. Let's just read just a little bit about them. The priestly party under the reign of King Herod and his successors, called by the rabbis the Boethusians, adherents to the family of Boethus, whose daughter was Miramani, was one of the wives of King Herod, and whose sons were successively made high priests by him. They follow the Sadducees in their opposition to the Pharisees. And so they're going to be bedfellows with the Sadducees, because again, like the Sadducees, they were bedfellows with Rome. Herod only reigned as king because of Rome. And the high priests were only high priests because of Rome. And they opposed the Pharisees because they were meddling in nearly every area of life. And they had this hope of a king who was going to come and rid Israel of Rome. Listen to what I want to look at another sect that's going to be extremely important for us, and that's the Zealots. Listen to what I'm going to read from the Encyclopedia Judaica again about the Zealots. Zealous defenders of the law and of the national life of the Jewish people. Name of a party opposing with relentless rigor any attempt to bring Judea under the dominion of idolatrous Rome, and especially of the aggressive and fanatical war party from the time of Herod until the time of the fall of Jerusalem and Masada. The members of this party also bore the name Sicarii, from their custom of going about with daggers hidden beneath their cloaks, which they would stab anyone found committing a sacrilegious act or anything provoking anti-Jewish feeling. So these guys were extremely zealous. And if you were a Sadducee or you were a Herodian who was outspoken defender of Rome and trying to strengthen Roman rule in the land, you didn't want to run into one of these guys in a crowd or a dark alley, because they were going to bring out a dagger and put an end to your life. It's from these ranks of the zealots that we get many messianic figures arise in Rome who advocate overthrowing Roman rise. And it's this advocating of a violent overthrow of Rome that will be one of the main factors in the death of Messiah. After he does things like going into the temple and overthrowing the tables of the money changers, they're going to see him as a zealot. And of course he was not a zealot. And they really had nothing to fear from him. But they will see him as a zealot. Listen as we read a little bit farther about these guys. The year 67 saw the beginning of the great war with the Roman legions, first under Vespasian and then under Titus. And Galilee was the onset chosen as the seat of war. The zealots fought with almost superhuman powers against the warriors trained in countless battles waged in all parts of the known world. And when they succumbed to superior military skill and overwhelming numbers, only after some act of treachery within the Jewish camp, they died with a fortitude and a spirit of heroic martyrdom which amazed and overawed their victors. Josephus' own description of the tragic end of the last of the great zealot leader, Eleazar ben Yair, and his men after the siege and final capture of Masada is the best refutation of the malicious charge against them. These zealots, we've all heard about Masada and the last stand on Masada. It was the zealots who made that last stand. One last group I want to look at is the Essenes. And the Essenes were separatists to the extreme. They separated themselves to remote areas of Israel and lived lives of purity. Listen to what is said about them. A branch of the Pharisees who conformed to the most rigid rules of the Levitical purity while aspiring to the highest degree of holiness. They lived solely by the work of their hands in a state of communism, devoted their time to study and devotion to the practice of benevolence, and refrained as far as feasible from conjugal intercourse and sensual pleasures in order to be initiated into the highest mysteries of heaven and cause the expected messianic time to come. So some feel that Yochanan the Immerser, John the Baptist, was an Essene because of some of the things he preached. Others say that Yeshua was an Essene. However, I don't think that's the case because Yeshua in his ministry that's recorded by the disciples shows no affiliation with any known parties. And the fact is, he states that his teachings came from the Father himself. And so he had no affiliation with any party. So this is the situation in Israel. And this is what Yeshua and the disciples are born into. And if you don't understand these things, then you're not going to understand the teachings of Yeshua, because these forces are the power of Jerusalem up until the destruction of the temple, and they're going to make life trying for those who live in the land, those who carry the good news out of the land. Their views will shape the life of the early believers and the life of the church for centuries to come. They'll be responsible for the making of much of what church dogma is today. And I know this probably wasn't one of the more interesting studies I do as far as inspiration, but it's going to be very important as we continue, because if you don't understand these things, you're not going to understand as we continue. So if there's anything that you didn't understand, ask questions. And if you didn't get it all down in your notes, get the CD when it becomes available next week, because the rest of the study is going to depend on this kind of knowledge. The pace of the study was going to get more interesting as we get into next week, and more inspirational as well. Really, when you think about it, 1 week of this setting the foundation is not so bad when you consider, when I did the study of Galatians, it was 3 weeks before we even opened the book of Galatians, before we even got to chapter 1. So 1 week of this isn't so bad, right? All right. But it's incumbent to please get lesson 1 down. If you got to listen to it again, get it down, because I mean this is really important to understanding Yeshua's teachings and the forces that are going to come against the early believers.